Woody Harrelson's dad was a contract killer. He was hired for the sole purpose of killing Judge John H. Wood Jr. Judge Wood was shot in the back with a deer rifle on Broadway Avenue.
He says, I killed Judge John Wood, and I also killed JFK.
Jimmy Chagra was the largest gambler.
Her name has been linked to the Judge Wood assassination since 1979.
I'm not going to make any comments on that.
At that time, it became the largest investigation in the history of the FBI.
Your father, William Sessions, he was a federal prosecutor, he was a federal judge, he was the director of the FBI. He oversaw some of the craziest cases and events in our country's history.
You don't threaten a federal judge without the Department of Justice coming down on you. The FBI showed up at my office. We've got your dad. He's just fine, but...
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are here with sitting U.S. Congressman Pete Sessions. Pete, how you doing today?
Brady, I'm great. What a delight to be on with you, not only your followers, but people who place high value on the United States of America, the greatest country in the world, American exceptionalism, and perhaps more importantly than that, one nation under God.
Amen, brother. I think we're on the same team, and I appreciate your support. You've been there for me over the last few years through the J6 prosecution and other things, and I am very appreciative, old chap. I wanted to discuss with you a couple interesting stories that was related to your father, who's an intriguing individual in American history. Your father, William Sessions, a guy covered a lot of ground, traversed a lot of the human experience. He was a federal prosecutor. He was a federal judge. He was the director of the FBI. And in his career, he oversaw some of the craziest cases and events in our country's history. A couple of those being the assassination of a federal judge by actor Woody Harrelson's father, Charles Harrelson, and then the prosecution of George Parr, who was an instrumental figure in stealing the Senate seat for Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1948, which it kind of toppled the dominoes and caused a chain of events that included his presidency, the Vietnam War, maybe the JFK assassination. But that event that George Parr helped him steal that seat changed American history. But if you don't mind, I wanted to get started on the Charles Harrelson and Chagra narco family a case in which your father was the federal judge. Would you mind setting it up and tell the audience how it came to be that your father was the judge that oversaw the conspiracy to assassinate federal Judge John Wood?
I will, Brady, and it's a story that is interesting and intriguing and still lends itself to, and there's supposedly going to be a movie made about it. It was in Texas Monthly, extensively covered. But the essence of this is in 1974, my father became a federal district judge and was assigned the El Paso docket. So he moved to El Paso. I was in college. Dad moved to El Paso, and it was a beginning of a time where the drug cartels were not formed yet, but there were essentially three major players in international drug circles. One, you've seen the movie Blow.
Yeah.
And Blow was about a guy whose last name was Young, who came out of the Northeast, but who moved and owned the California market. Another is Jimmy Chagra. Jimmy Chagra is out of El Paso, Texas. He's a Lebanese man and a large Lebanese community in El Paso, Texas. And then a third man who I don't remember his name, but they essentially were the three main people who began doing business with Carlos Slater in Mexico. They had the airplanes, they would fly planes. Jimmy Chagra is what I'll focus on. Jimmy Chagra began purchasing former B-25s from the military. The DEA in about 1972 or 3 began finding these airplanes out in the middle of New Mexico desert or West Texas that had landed, abandoned, were burned out, but the residue that was on them indicated that they were hauling marijuana, large plane loads of marijuana that came into the country. Jimmy Chagra was the head of this effort, went down to Colombia many times to set this issue up, Mexico. Jimmy Chagra, during this period of time, became well known to law enforcement because he was the largest gambler up till that time in Las Vegas.
Yeah, I heard he was the biggest whale in the history of whales. He would bet $1 million a night.
He, in fact, would, as the DEA and the FBI began to look deeper into it, once they, and this is a long winding story about how they figured out it was Jimmy Chagra, but Jimmy Chagra was about to be indicted. And Jimmy Chagra was brother, who he had Lee Chagra, who scored the highest on his bar exam of anybody coming out of law school, University of Texas. And Lee Chagra was a lawyer who represented Jimmy and his interests. But Lee was before United States District Judge John H. Wood Jr. in El Paso. And Judge Wood, right, wrong, or indifferent, said to Lee Chagra and another lawyer, looking forward to seeing you guys next week. That became an indication to Lee Chagra that Jimmy was getting ready to be indicted. They knew that the feds were all over them, the DEA, the FBI. They were putting things together. They had looked at his trail, as it were, in Vegas, had not invested a lot of time in him. Jimmy Chagra, it all developed, hired a man who was Charles V. Harrelson. Charles Harrelson, who is Woody Harrelson's dad, was a contract killer. He had served time in prison. He had earned his wings about doing things for hire. He was hired for the sole purpose of killing Judge John H. Wood Jr. In San Antonio. He went through, and we can go through this now. You'll hear me say it later, but the trail that led to Judge Wood was not all known for a number of years. Judge Wood was shot in the back with a deer rifle on Broadway Avenue outside of his apartment in San Antonio. It immediately sent shockwaves through not only federal law enforcement, but through judges. And you just don't kill a federal judge. You don't threaten a federal judge and get away with this without the Department of Justice coming down on you. So immediately Judge Wood was killed. I lived in San Antonio at the time. The FBI showed up at my office that I worked at in San Antonio and said, just want you to know, we don't suspect anything, but your dad is a judge. You're here in San Antonio. We've got your dad. He's just fine. And immediately the FBI and U.S. Marshals took over the custody of not only their security, but the homes and the people that were around them. It took several years for the Bureau, that was the lead agency, to figure out who did this, how it happened. There had been an assistant U.S. attorney when Dad had been U.S. attorney. that was shot at in San Antonio, theoretically by believed to be banditos. Banditos were the number one motorcycle gang that was under investigation for trafficking of narcotics, trafficking of other drugs,
Human trafficking,
trafficking
everything.
cash,
Yeah.
mostly, on behalf of these, smaller, now we look back, smaller drug cartels, but on behalf of this, but no real connection to Jimmy Chagra. The FBI began this manhunt, this investigation. At that time, it became the largest investigation in the history of the FBI. It involved every field office. And just like when President Kennedy was killed, all field offices were notified to ask for information. This, in fact, went way deeper because Jimmy Chagra or these drug organizations knew they existed. And so immediately the FBI, the DEA went into this solid discussion trying to figure things out. No one could figure it out. It was a tight loop that Jimmy Chagra had created. Obviously, the indictment, the meeting did not happen that next week with Judge Wood, who was dead. Everything was thrown into chaos. Several years later, as information began unraveling, there was a man who was in prison in the state of Texas, in Huntsville, Texas. And he had a roommate who was called Charles V. Harrelson Jr. Charles Harrelson, by this period of time, was in prison and was suffering hallucinations from cocaine addiction that he had. He was held out and he could not get this cocaine. And at night, he would begin speaking to this then man who helped the Bureau. By the way, anybody that's in prison will do anything to get out of prison. Snitch is what they typically call them. This guy's name is Spinelli. Mr. Spinelli was a man who was born in Russia, who came to the United States, was in the state penitentiary for charges related to, I don't really recall, but either rape or not registering.
He had like 20 felonies, and and
had
it was
a
everything.
bunch.
Yeah.
He had a bunch, but at that time, he was held out because he had not registered as a sex offender. So he was the roommate for Charles V. Harrelson, and he would listen to Charles Harrelson. And Charles Harrelson at night was saying, "Damn, I should not have killed that judge. That was stupid. I should," and began talking in his sleep. So, of course, Spinelli immediately got a note to the warden, and the warden went to the Department of Public Safety and just simply a very, very nondescript, but said, "My roommate's talking about he killed a judge." Well, immediately the FBI came down, they got involved. They now had what was presumptively a story. They used Spinelli to gain as much information as they could, kept them as roommates, came to the court, and the FBI said, "Look, we have a confidential informant, but who wants something. We want your agreement since you're the now chief judge of the Western District of Texas. We want you to offer him a deal in regard for what he's going to do for us." And of course, my dad did say, "Yes, we will do that." And so Spinelli gathered information. At some point, they then figured out, as Spinelli engaged him, "Hey, you were talking in your sleep last night. Tell me about this. I'm a con, you're a con." And the words then came out about where the rifle was located.
And that was recorded, correct?
And it was, he had this on tape. And so he provided that to the Bureau. All of a sudden, they figured out it was in Jimmy Chagra. So the name now Chagra came up. And Jimmy Chagra, and he said that he had drawn a map of where he had thrown the rifle. And the map was put in Jimmy Chagra's house, which was a great big compound out in El Paso, large compound. Jimmy had a lot of money, largest, once again, gambler in Vegas history. As this unrolled itself, then the FBI, about 50 different law enforcement agencies or members of law enforcement, all different types, they descended with it was signed by my father, a search warrant specifically into the safe that Jimmy Chagra had. That it's a story about them opening it up, but they got it open. They found the map, arrested Jimmy Chagra, some 8 other people, including his wife, eventually Liz, the 2 brothers. A number of people were indicted for conspiracy to kill a federal judge. All of a sudden, the FBI had a case now, and they began looking at Jimmy Chagra. Charles Harrelson was then changed his venue to where the feds came and got him and held him.
Can I stop you for a second just to add a little context? So the judge was known as Maximum John. And in 9 years, every single drug offender that he was sentenced to the maximum amount of jail or prison time that he could do so. And he was very smug about it. He didn't pull any punches. He let these people know he hated drugs and drug dealers, and he sent them he would let them rot in jail. And Woody Harrelson's father was so strung out on cocaine that when they had a warrant for him, he went on the run. But he was so strung out on cocaine that somewhere around Van Horn, Texas, he started hallucinating. He gets out of his car thinking agents are all around him. He pulls out a pistol, shoots out his own tire, and then as people are driving by, he's waving the gun at the people in the cars, and then the police come. And there's a little bit of a stalemate, and he's worried he's going to get shot. And he admits to killing John Wood. He says, I killed Judge John Wood, and I also killed JFK. And he did that because he thought if he said that, they wouldn't shoot him. And turns out he was right, and he was arrested. Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and all these things ended up him, but they did not have any direct evidence. The Bureau could not link all this up until Spinelli came forward. So what they developed in the investigation, then the Bureau goes right after it. Hundreds of agents descend upon El Paso. The DEA and the Intelligence Center gathering information, putting together all these airplanes. They descend upon Las Vegas. And that's where one of his lawyers was Oscar Goodman. But they figured out that, and got plenty of people to say, Jimmy Chagra was the #1 gambler in the history of Vegas. And it was not unusual for him to give a $10,000 tip to a person who brought him a drink, a person who, a beautiful woman. But here's what they also figured out. They figured out that what Jimmy would do is he would send 2 weeks ahead of him coming to Vegas, 3 and 4 rider vans filled with money in boxes.
Wow.
And that the casinos in El Paso and Vegas would spend all night feeding these into their machines. And you've seen it where they all this money, and it adds up everything. And he would generally then have a tab of about $7 million.
Wow.
For him to go spend a week in Vegas. And he stayed in their best suites. He was their #1 gambler. He would tip people. Money meant nothing, but it was ones, fives, tens, 20s, hundreds, all this drug money that was getting laundered because he had so much money. he wanted to launder the money, turn it into money that he had won at Vegas. Well, they're on to him. So this very quickly erupted into a knowledgeable person. The feds, the Department of Justice, descended upon them, gathered information, started talking to witnesses, and all roads led to Jimmy. Here's what they found out. They found out they had to piece together the murder. And Charles Harrelson landed or got a rent car, or his car, I think is a rent car, and stayed at the airport in Midland, Odessa. He then boarded a plane. The people who were at the airports, as you know, airports take pictures of every license plate every day. They had the car when it arrived. They had the car when it stayed. They had the airline ticket then where Charles Harrelson flew to San Antonio, got another rent car. They pieced it all together. Without all this, I can't tell you what would have happened, except they pieced it together. There were 9 subsequent trials as a result of those that my dad did. There was obviously a fight over change of venue, not to do it in San Antonio, and where it would be. So Dad moved several of them to Florida. But the Charles Harrelson trial was in San Antonio. Took a couple weeks. I attended that trial. Harrelson was a very interesting guy. He was a guy who would sit back in his chair and grin at people and make faces to people. He would challenge the things that were said. And my father actually had to say, "You will not make any visual comments or show any emotion." But whenever Dad was out of the court, Charles Harrelson was, Mr. Cool Guy, going and shaking hands with people. Very interesting circumstance. They eventually convicted everyone, all 9 of those. Charles Harrelson ended up dying in prison. Dad ended up then, as a result of all this, then by 1987, President Reagan and the Department of Justice said, "We want you to be our FBI director." FBI directors are chosen by presidents for reasons. Dad, as you know, if you read enough, then became involved in John Gotti, La Cosa Nostra, the mob, and then Dad began putting the things in place to take on drug cartels.
I wanted to tell you, so years ago, I used to volunteer at a homeless shelter called The Bridge in Dallas. Wonderful place. And there are some very interesting transient figures. And there I met a former employee of Jimmy Chagra. And the story he told me, what these guys were involved in. And so when that investigation went down, there was 87,000 man hours and at least 30,000 people in the federal government in some way touched the case. And this gentleman at one point drove Charles Harrelson, and he didn't know why he was driving him, but driving him to either to the airport or to the car to the airport. And when he heard that John Wood had been assassinated in San Antonio, he was worried that Jimmy Chagra was going to off him because he was somehow a direct witness. And so this guy, he had a long ponytail, bald on top, and I was in the intake and I heard him speak in Spanish, and I speak Spanish. And I said, "¿Dónde usted aprendió tu español?" And he said, "Well, I spent 10 years in a Mexican prison." And I said, "Well, what was that for?" He said, "Well, I killed a police officer." And I said, "Why did you kill a police officer?" And he said that he had driven Charles Harrelson around. He heard about the murder. He fled to Mexico, to Juarez. And while he was down there, he saw a couple police officers sneaking up, not to arrest him, but they had guns drawn in a way that he knew that they were getting ready to shoot him. So he shoots one of the police officers. He gets arrested. His father pays $100,000 to the judge. He gets off on self-defense for the murder, but has to do 10 years for having a gun in Mexico, which is extremely prohibited. And for that $100,000, he got next to his cell, they built a little housing unit for his wife so he could have daily conjugal visits. And then and while he was in, the interesting thing is Jimmy Chagra, they convicted him on drugs, but because there was some kind of witness that the jury didn't like, he got off on the conspiracy to commit murder in Jacksonville in the trial in Florida. He got off. He stayed in jail for the rest of his life, but he got off. But this guy, he was in jail for 10 years, and he said he could not sleep because he thought Jimmy Chagra could get him in while he was still in prison in a Mexican jail.
There are hundreds of these stories. As you suggested, it was the largest manhunt in the history of the FBI. And it went through years of Jimmy Chagra and all of these drug cartels of how they operated, what they did, how they went to Colombia, who they dealt with there,
and
there was a trace
with what they were carrying. They would fill up tankers. The amounts of marijuana were in the like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so the amount of money for the 70s, we got to remember what a dollar was worth then, and they were doing tens of millions of dollars of business back then. And it's a fascinating story. There's a book that you turned me on to called Dirty Dealing by Gary Cartwright. An insane, captivating read, a wonderful story. So I wanted to go ahead and transition into how your father, as a federal prosecutor, how he ended up breaking up this criminal political ring led by George Parr, the Duke of Duval County, who was the gentleman that got, I think his name was election judge Luis Salas, to fill out hundreds of false ballots, all in his own handwriting. He puts them in the box in alphabetical order, and there's a tied race for the Senate seat in a runoff, and LBJ is down a couple hundred votes, and all of a sudden, ballot box 13 shows up 6 days later, and he becomes a senator, then goes on to be the president. Could you tell a little bit more about that wild tale and then how your father became involved?
Yes, that was in 1948, an election, a runoff, and to determine who would be the senator. The senator from Marlin, Texas, died, and LBJ ended up running. This is a really interesting process that really, to the basis of it, is very criminal, but they held the boxes, once again, 1948, not a lot of communication. They held these boxes so that once they knew the final answer, the rest of the state, they then had these appear and then began reporting. They reported that they did not have all of the votes, that they were still out, that a car had broken down that was bringing those in. They were having to go get it and retrieve it. Big story. The bottom line to the whole thing is that George and Archer Parr were a father-son, and they lived there in Duval County. The state constitution, the state of Texas, which still is being rethought about, that you probably know even today, off this viewpoint that only the district attorney of a county can prosecute a criminal matter. The state of Texas, the Attorney General of Texas, does not have jurisdiction. And of course, now, all these years later, there's a big argument in the Court of Criminal Appeals ruled, and now the state of Texas is challenging that and changing the law because of what is commonly called a George Soros matter. George Soros has gone and elected district attorneys, Dallas County, Bexar County,
Harris
Tarrant
County. Oh
County,
yeah, all the big
Harris
counties.
County, and these district attorneys will not prosecute certain types of cases. And the state of Texas has an interest to make sure that state law is followed.
Is that what
And
happened to
so,
George Parr?
no. So what happened is that there was respect for that because it was one county, but they kept getting these reports of all this money where George and Archer Parr, one the county judge, one the district attorney, and they would switch back and forth, were skimming millions of dollars out of that county for their own purposes, putting a lot of it into their own farm and acreage that they had there. And so there kept being these stories throughout the years. In 1973 and 1971, my father became U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Texas. This was a continuing problem. There were reports of it. People who were in the community were taken advantage of completely. The county, the state of Texas understood what was going on, but had no jurisdiction because of this effort. So Dad, as a result of working with John Hill, who was the Democrat, but who was the Attorney General, worked with Dad, and Dad said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do an investigation. And as it turned out, the federal investigation got the Parrs off using the mail to commit a federal crime, not reporting their money, the IRS. So they did this detailed investigation. You can read that, and it is also an interesting book. In this case, Gary Cartwright essentially wrote everything from the defendant's perspective. So the Cartwright book is not really a lot about the prosecution. They characterize it. This was written entirely by a man who is now passed away, John Clark, who was Dad's first assistant and then became U.S. Attorney. They went after this, and it is a fascinating book. Sometimes if you go back, it is called the Duke of Duval.
Okay.
And it is I think 10 times the read of Gary Cartwright. Not against Gary, it's just this was the prosecutors, investigators' view of how they went and materially figured out how they did what they did, how they corrupted people, how they had a system. And as the team, the investigative team was flying a helicopter onto the property, this vast property, with the FBI, IRS, and Texas Rangers, he killed himself.
Oh, yeah, he didn't want to face the music. Well, how is it? How back in the late 40s and through the time that LBJ was in power, how was the system so tilted in the favor of these guys that when after ballot box 13 came in late, they knew that everything was in the same handwriting. It looked very fraudulent. And then a sitting U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Hugo Black, created an injunction that prohibited an investigation into the knowingly false ballots. So how did it occur that they had such control that even at the Supreme Court level, they couldn't get an investigation going?
Well, as we know, any one-party system becomes corrupt. You were taking on a man who then had served as a member of Congress, was a powerful United States senator, and certainly, as you know, I mean, all you have to do is watch the movie on Lincoln to know the power of a president. the power of a president to appoint people to certain circumstances, to become in the government, to become a federal judge. And so LBJ used his power. And in fact, Bobby Kennedy became engaged in this also on behalf of Lyndon Johnson and dismissed the suit from the Department of Justice perspective.
The way that George Parr got involved is that he was, I think, in jail for tax evasion, and then somehow LBJ, as a congressman, organized a pardon for him from Harry Truman. And so that's when the favor mill started to spin. And in return, he got LBJ the Senate seat. And then somehow later on, when the investigation was brewing up and they were looking into George Parr again, Bobby Kennedy drops the case.
Did.
Wow.
All these things happen over a period of years, and political patronage and political influence. And so as Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy was involved, Supreme Court Justice, the power that existed. Once again, you now had a winner. You had a winner that became the Vice President of the United States, then the President of the United States. All of this in the intrigue of Kennedy being killed.